Point debate for agenda items 7 to 10 on objections regarding various GMOs. So I will give the floor to the MEPs that have signed the draft motion for resolution, starting with T. Metz for the Greens, then SND, GUE, non-inscrit, and Sirpa Pietikäinen, and then, of course, before giving the floor to the Commission, to other groups or members willing to do so. So let's start with T. Metz from the Greens.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you very much.
All GMOs that have all been made tolerant to one or more herbicides, including glyphosate and glyphosate. I would like to use the opportunity of this debate to ask the Commission 3 questions. I noticed that we often disagree on what the European regulations provide. So my first question is, do we agree that when drafting its decisions, the Commission has to take into account any relevant legislation and relevant legitimate factors? My second question is, what are legitimate factors to you? Is protection of biodiversity not a legitimate factor? Is increased exposure to toxic herbicide not a legitimate factor for agriculture workers in third countries? Is contribution to large-scale deforestation in countries of cultivation not a legitimate factor? Now I expect you to say that all these issues are to you the responsibility of third countries, but we, as the European Union, have signed up to international obligations regarding health and environment. In the end, my question is very simple. Does the Commission agree that it is necessary to take into account the EU's international obligations regarding health and environment, such as the UN Sustainable Development Goals or the Paris Climate Agreement, when it makes decisions on GMO authorizations? Thank you.
Thank you. For SND, Günther Sild.
Sehr geehrte Kolleginnen und Kollegen, wir haben
colleagues. In this committee and in plenary, we've had very strong majorities behind these resolutions, and I hope that be the case this time too. This afternoon, the votes are about extensions and new authorizations. It's to do with cotton, soybeans, and 2 strains of maize. In most cases, a gene has been added, and this is toxic for certain insect species. The resistance here is primarily against glyphosate and glyphosate. Glyphosate is banned in Europe since 2018 because of its reproductive toxicity. 2015 saw the discussion in Europe about the banning of glyphosate, and it has been banned in Austria. As you know, planting genetically modified plants leads to the increased use of pesticides. This leads to greater resistance, which in turn leads to high pesticide residues in the harvest. If we debate pesticide bans in Europe, and on the other hand allow pesticide-resistant products, then we are contradicting ourselves. This is not consistent, and therefore the S&D group will be voting in favor of rejection. Thank you.
For the GUE, Anja Hazekamp.
Yes, thank you. Sadly, once again, the Commission is renewing existing authorizations and granting new authorizations for genetic engineered maize, soy and cotton, which are unsafe, have no democratic legitimacy and increase the use of hazardous pesticides. And these GMOs belong to the sort of archaic, destructive agriculture that we need to get rid of if we want to have a chance to preserving a livable planet. And authorizing massive imports of maize, soy and cotton that have been made resistant to glyphosate and glufosinate, which are toxic for the human and environmental health, and that also produce Bt toxins that threaten moths and butterflies, is a giant step back. It's the logic of the previous century, when we thought that chemical pesticides and fertilizers were the solution. And now we know that they are causing a lot of problems. And I know that the European Commission will say to us that they are obliged to authorize these imports, even though there is never a qualified majority of member states in favor of the authorization. But that is simply not true. Of course, the Commission is legally bound to take a decision after the vote in the Appeals Committee, but Article 6, Paragraph 3 of the Comitology Regulation allows the Commission to not authorize the GMO in question if there is no qualified majority of the member states in favor. And the European Commission is also not obliged to follow EFSA's assessment, especially since these assessments are not complete and do not take the hazardous residues on the imported products into account. So my question is simple. Will the Commission finally commit to not authorizing any more GMOs when there is not a qualified majority of member states in favor? Surely this is the least you can do to respect the democratic decision making. Thank you.
Thank you. Eleonora Evi, for non-inscrits.
Thank you, Chair. The vast majority of genetically modified plants for import have been made tolerant to one or more complementary herbicides, potentially leading to increased residues on the imports, and this is a fact. However, analysis of the residues, as well as the herbicides breakdown products and the possible cumulative and cocktail effects, are considered outside the remit of the EFSA GMO panel. This is despite the fact that, as recognized by EFSA, the way that herbicides are broken down on a GM crop can be driven by the genetic modification itself, which has implications for toxicity. So the question would be, when and how does the Commission intend to close this gap in the risk assessment so that the residues of the herbicides are properly assessed as part of the GMO authorization process? Thank you.
Thank you. Sirpa Pietikäinen for the EPP has co-signed, but she's not there. So I will give the floor for the EPP to Jessica Pojard.
Thank you, Chair. I will start as a true politician to quote myself and to repeat some of the things that I have already said in this committee. The last time we discussed these kind of similar objections, and that's because the EPP line hasn't changed. Because I still think that EFSA has been given this mandate and they haven't overstepped it. And the question raised is that we don't have to follow EFSA. But the question is then what do we need EFSA for if we're not supposed to listen to their advice? And in these actual cases, they have not identified anything that would indicate that these crops are more harmful than their conventional counterparts. And I think that if EFSA says that the product is safe, we should trust their scientific point of view and their advice. And therefore, I think that the Commission has not overstepped their mandate, and I think that I would like to encourage all my colleagues and this committee to vote against these objections. Thank you.
I don't have speakers for Renew, so I move to ECR. Alexander Vondra.
Well, thank you. Just a couple of minutes ago, we discussed the biodiversity, and we were lucky here because science and the ideological stands follow the same line. Here we do have a problem, and ECR traditional stays behind the science. And simply we would oppose all those 4 objections because they are mostly driven by ideology, by some fears. The EU risk assessment process for GM crops and foods is one of the strictest in the world, and it is robust enough to ensure that approved GMO products are as safe as conventionally grown products. And I think that GMOs regulation must be underpinned by science, and if the objectivity and authority of this science is open to political questions, then we risk undermining the legitimacy of our entire regulatory system. Just look how we can criticize climate skepticism on those who oppose the vaccination on evidence-based grounds, while we are systematically ignoring EFSA repeated conclusions that GMO crops are perfectly safe. So, look, I understand that some of you have political objections there. I understand the Christian Democrats can have an opinion on that. But I believe it's important to know that whilst the use of the GMO for food use is limited, the EU dependency on GMO protein crops for use in animal fuel is significant. And to continue with those objections, and there is a majority for this, can have at the end of the day devastating effect on the EU as such. So here simply we have our reservation.
Thank you. Now other speakers. Okay, so we move to the Commission with DG Santé representative.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. Thanks for the comments. I have, of course, listened very carefully to all the interventions. I have to confirm that all the procedural steps have been followed within the implementing powers which have been conferred to the Commission by the existing legislation. EFSA has performed a comprehensive risk assessment and has concluded that the products are safe. The Commission consulted the public on the draft opinions, and all the public comments have been taken into account by EFSA. On this basis, on the basis of the positive EFSA opinion, the Commission, yes, submitted the proposals to the committees, and it is correct that we do not get opinions from the committees, but that doesn't mean that in the absence of an opinion, the Commission should not authorize in the light of positive EFSA opinions. We need to underline that the products are considered as safe and that the objective of the legislation is to ensure that the GMO products put on the EU market are safe. Now, regarding the other factors which have been highlighted by some of the interventions, we have to realize that decisions to confirm the safety of individual products cannot have a direct link with the volume of imports from an individual third country, nor on the achievement of the international obligations of the Union. We are speaking here about the authorization of individual products to ensure they are safe. How can they resolve the problem of climate change, deforestation, or other international obligations? That being said, the authorization of these GMOs do not undermine at all the implementation of the international obligations, as the predecessor of the Commission explained earlier this morning, through comprehensive, coherent strategies. Importantly, the authorization of individual GMOs do not undermine in any way the reflection launched on the development of EU protein plants, which will do what? Which, if it is successful, will enable a reduced dependency on imports. We have to realize that our farming sector is dependent on these imported proteins. And we have to ensure that these imported proteins are safe. This is the objective of the legislation. And we have this dependency. There is a demand for these products in the EU. So the objective of the reflection on the EU protein plan is not undermined by authorizing individual GMOs. On the contrary, the reflection should be carried on so that the consumption decreases of these imports. The authorization of individual GMOs do not undermine the implementation, for example, of the EU action on deforestation. What is the objective? Is to increase the consumption of deforestation-free products. So we have to act on the consumption of the products to ensure that deforestation decreases. It's not the approval on the safety of a GMO which is going to resolve it. It's the consumption, it's the dependency. So we really want to underline that there are no specific factors to these individual GMOs which can invalidate the authorization because they are safe. EFSA has concluded they are safe, and this is why the Commission, according to the GMO regulation, has to take a decision, and this is why the decision has to be positive. In conclusion, I would say that although, of course, the Parliament is, in principle, only allowed, if I may say so, with all respect, to challenge the authorization if the Commission has or has not exceeded implementing powers, I have to underline that, of course, we have respected the implementing powers, but we also recognize that there is disagreement or misunderstanding, and of course we are most happy as ever to hold dialogues and respond to the points, and I hope that the summary of the reflection of the Commission on the draft resolutions has at least responded to the concerns and enables a genuine dialogue which enables us to progress on the international obligations, but also to help us implementing the legislation as it has been adopted by this House and the Council some years ago. Thank you very much.
Thank you.